So there are currently three hypotheses about why memory errors actually occur. Um, the first one would be simply decay, right? So just like other memories are subject to fading away or eroding over time, it's the same for these types of memories, right? Over time, if we don't think about something often, right, eventually that memory trace will get weaker and weaker and fade, and we will forget. The second hypothesis is that memory errors occur because of interference, and that's exactly what we were just talking about. There's interference that happened after the fact, which interferes with our original memory, so it becomes altered over time as we learn new information that may actually disrupt that original memory. So anything that's introduced post-event then becomes part of it and might falsify it or interfere with it. And then, of course, there's also retrieval failure. So a memory might actually be intact and it's encoded in memory, but maybe the cues that are being presented to you might actually not trigger the activation to that memory. So, right, we've already talked a little bit about multiple retrieval routes, right? That's why we try to learn things in many different ways. So we encode it in multiple different ways. So there's many different pathways to get to the information. But sometimes information is maybe encoded in a very specific way, and then the cues that are being presented are not matching that, so we can't access that memory. So it's there, but it can't be accessed at that time, right? It might be that it could be actually retrieved later on if the right cue is presented, but that would still be considered a memory error because at any given point in time, you might not be able to access that information. So this is something that, of course, is very important when it comes to considering eyewitness testimony in court cases, right? Usually, having an eyewitness testimony that says, I identified the person, this was the person, right? That actually carries a lot of weight in court cases. When in reality, we should be very careful when we listen to people's eyewitness testimony because of what we just learned, right? Our memories can actually be quite fragile. Right? We assume that people really remember accurately what they have seen, but based on what you just learned, right, you should think twice about that in the future, right? It's quite possible that, maybe in the heat of the moment, right, you didn't encode the information maybe as well as you thought you did, or maybe people interviewing you after the crime may have actually changed or altered your memory of that. So those types of things, but they're not just hypotheticals, but they've actually happened in the real world. But there's many cases of mistaken identities where people have been even convicted and sent onto death row based on eyewitness testimony. But then when DNA evidence became more user friendly, right, and available, they were in some cases exonerated because they knew then that they couldn't have committed the crime because the DNA evidence didn't match, and they then later were released from prison, right? So we know that we can't always 100% trust eyewitness testimony because of that constructive nature of memory that we've already heard a lot about. So that, of course, is something that is really important to keep in mind because our memories are fragile. So I have a little excerpt that I wanted to share with you, but and this is really from an eyewitness that witnessed a crime, and then he was looking at a lineup. So I'm going to read what the witness actually said at the time when they were showing the lineup. Oh my God, I don't know. It's one of these two, but I don't know. Oh man, the guy a little bit taller than number two. It's one of those two, but I don't know. And then 30 minutes later, still viewing the lineup and having difficulty making a decision, the witness finally says, I don't know, number two. And then the officer that administers the lineup says, okay. And then months later at the trial, right, they asked the witness, were you positive it was number two? It wasn't a maybe. And then the eyewitness answered and said, there was no maybe about it. I was absolutely positive. So this was actually from a study that was done in 1998 by Wells and Badfield. You can also look this up in the book. And right, it just shows you how your memories change over time, even though the eyewitness was kind of doubting themselves initially. Later, right, they encoded it that it was definitely number 2, and they felt very confident, right? So that's really important to keep in mind if you're really considering eyewitness testimony to convict somebody of a crime. So this was the study that I was also just talking about. So they asked participants to view security tapes with a gunman, and they viewed it for only 8 seconds. So very quick, just like in a kind of a crime scene. What they found was that actually everybody, right, when they were shown a lineup, they identified somebody from the photograph, right? There was nobody saying, like, I don't think the person is actually in the picture. When in reality, in the study, they actually didn't put the actual gunman's picture in the lineup. So people felt compelled to identify somebody in the lineup, even though, right, the person that they had seen in the videotape wasn't even there, right? So basically telling people that when you're, getting a lineup, right, it's always possible that the person isn't there. So keep that in mind when making your choice. They've also found that actually showing pictures sequentially rather than simultaneously is actually a much better method, but we'll get to that more in just a little bit. So we've already talked about, right, the weapons focus and how that can really narrow your focus. So when you're obviously in an extremely stressful situation, right, we talked about how emotions can actually enhance memory, but it can also really narrow your focus and actually, make your memory worse. So some memory errors occur because of lack of attentional, or, maybe your focus narrow. And it, of course, has to do with your inner state, right, your arousal levels. So your attention can be really narrowed by a specific stimuli. So if you're being very stressed because there's a gun involved or a shot is even being fired, but that, of course, would influence your memory of the situation. So that's, of course, called the weapons focus, and we'd already talked about that a little bit. So in this Stanley and Johnson study that you can see the graph below here, right, they found that across the board that people had poorer memory in the condition where they watched a crime, but when a shot was fired versus when there was no shot fired. So as you can see, the orange represents when a shot was fired, right? Same scene, everything was the same, except that one time a shot was fired in the orange condition, or a shot was not fired in the green condition. So across the board, it really impacted the amount of details that people were able to recall from the scene. And it included information about the predator, about the victim, and also about the weapon. So that shows us clear evidence that actually having a weapon present, right, really decreases memory because it really narrows your focus, right, your attention probably on that weapon, or maybe you're frozen with fear that you really can't devote your attentional resources to encoding information altogether. So, right, errors happen a lot of times because of suggestive questions. So being very careful about how investigators actually ask questions is really important, and something that requires a lot of more research. Really avoiding any kind of suggestive questions is recommended, rather than asking closed-ended questions like, how tall was the predator, right? Or what angle was the car coming in as the cars collided, kind of thing. It should be avoided. You should just basically ask an open-ended question and just say, tell me about what happened, right? And don't prompt them, and don't basically elicit information, right? You want them to tell you what happened. You don't want to extract it, right? Even if it's not there. You want them to do the talking as much as possible. So avoid suggestive questions, right? And that's, of course, because of the misinformation effect. That has also been shown to be really important when it comes to identifying people from a lineup. So this is called the post-identification feedback effect. So in a study by Wells and Bradfield, they tested just that. They asked people to look at a lineup of people, and they also wanted to see if maybe getting feedback or no feedback would actually influence how confident they felt in the person that they had identified. So they watched a video of a crime, and then they were asked to pick a predator from the photo spread. And there were three possible conditions. The person that they identified, right? The person that was with them when they were identifying the predator either gave them confirming feedback, so saying, good, you identified the suspect, or receiving no feedback, so they just remained quiet, or they actually received disconfirming feedback, so basically saying that that actually was not the right person. And they, of course, controlled for, if they actually picked the right person or not, and so forth, right? You could look at the details of the study in the textbook. And what they found was, but if you look below, there are the little numbers between the green, below the green boxes that indicate the confidence levels. So people's confidence level, and right, remember that this had nothing to do with if they actually picked the right person or not, right, was much higher if they received confirming feedback. So if the person that was with them said, good, you identified the suspect, that increased their confidence as opposed to when they received no feedback or even disconfirming feedback. So by just the mere fact that, maybe a police officer or whoever is with a person gives them any kind of feedback could already alter their memory again, and therefore also increase their confidence, even if maybe it was the wrong person that they identified. So what's being done about this, right? So we obviously have to keep this in mind, right? This is obviously of really great importance for the legal system, and something that was oftentimes overlooked for a long time. As I mentioned earlier, right? Many people were just convicted based on eyewitness testimony that in some cases turned out to be false later on. So what's really recommended is that rather than doing kind of traditional interviews, that people actually do what is called a cognitive interview. So, inform witnesses that the predators may or may not be in the lineup, right? So recognizing that it's possible that they're not there, right? Also making sure that you use fillers that are innocent, so you can kind of test if this person is just going to identify anybody, right? Because they want to identify somebody. So use known innocent fillers to make sure, right, to kind of test the witness's credibility. As I mentioned earlier, also using sequential presentation rather than simultaneous is beneficial. And then also using cognitive interview strategies rather than just traditional methods where you ask very close-ended questions, right, that are going to get very short responses. So you want to make sure that you're eliciting open-ended questions and get kind of information from them that they remember, but you're not extracting information. So asking kind of more open-ended questions like, tell me about what happened, but don't ask many specific questions would actually be much more beneficial. One quick word that I wanted to say about mistaken identity is, even though this is quite, common if the predator was an unknown, right? If it's a stranger to you, it's quite possible that an eyewitness testimony would identify somebody that actually didn't commit the crime. So I think that's where a lot of those cases come from, where we see people being falsely convicted of crimes, even though they didn't commit them. That being said, I wanted to make sure that you understood that mistaken identity is actually very rare in cases of where people were maybe attacked, assaulted by somebody that they actually knew, right? So this was something that was in the media about a year ago. And that seems much less likely, kind of looking at the research evidence, right? We would remember who the attacker is if we knew their identity, but it's much, much less likely that there would be a case of mistaken identity if you were attacked by somebody, but you wouldn't just say, oh, it was this person, and later would turn out, oh, oops, I mixed up the people. That's highly, highly unlikely. Mistaken identity is much more common if the attacker was an unknown. Okay, so this concludes our lecture on Chapter 8, and I look forward to talking to you again when we talk about Chapter 9 on knowledge.